Okay, so today's Ancient DOS game is Zephyr, and if you're having a hard time figuring out what's going on in the game right now, well, that makes two of us. This is probably the most erratic game I've ever played. I mean, I know how to play it, and I know what I'm supposed to be doing, but the low frame rate combined with the extreme speed at which everything happens means you pretty much have very little control over the entire ordeal. So you just gotta play the way you think it's gonna work and just hope for the best. And what makes this experience even stranger is that every other aspect of this game is fine. The graphics are good, the voice acting is decent, there's a lot of voice acting if you can believe that. The music isn't bad, even the controls work as expected. But this really feels like a situation where the devs had a neat idea for a game, clearly had game making skills, and just ended up with a mess they couldn't back out of and decided, screw it, we've come this far, we gotta just push it out and move on. The biggest irony being that the packaging for this game makes the bold claim of this being the ultimate competitor. Well, fun fact, virtually every game which uses the word ultimate to describe itself isn't just overselling its quality, it's overselling its quality by a massive amount. Ultimate? More like ultanaut. I'm sorry.
No early departure from this competition. Get back to the battle.
So yeah, this game was actually developed and published by New World Computing in 1994. The same New World Computing responsible for the critically acclaimed Might and Magic series. I honestly have no idea what inspired them to try to branch out like this. Or maybe they just had an idea, wanted to give it a try, and this is where we ended up. In any case, it explains why the game's assets are as high quality as they are, despite the gameplay not being up to spec. As for the genre, if you couldn't tell from the gameplay, because really how can you, this is a one-player combat racing game. Now, supposedly there's multiplayer support, but I need to explain a few things before I comment on that. As for the graphics, the game runs in a VGA 320x200 256 color graphics mode, and as for audio, it supports the Gravis Ultrasound and Sonic Soundscape and Sound Blaster cards. Now, as for its current release date, it's still commercial, and this is where things get weird. So I bought the CD for this game a while ago, and as far as I could tell at the time, the game was never released in a box, only in a jewel case, with said jewel case release going for about $10 to $12 on places like eBay. But as I started researching this game for this week's video, I discovered a number of sellers selling floppy disk versions of the game with a full-sized manual and installation guide. But this made even less sense because the game is way too big to fit on a single floppy disk. So what the heck's going on here? Well, let's demystify this situation at least a little. The game did have a full boxed release, but the box was a very non-standard shape, freestanding as a sort of elongated trapezoid, with the cover art spanning 3 of the 4 different sides. So the manual and install guide belong with the CD, but because the box was such a difficult and non-standard thing, extremely few examples of it are still out there. The floppy disk, on the other hand, does not contain the full game. Rather, it's a version 1.1 patch, and for some bizarre reason, there's a lot of sellers out there trying to peddle this disc with the manual and install guide as the full game. It's all very confusing. But just to add to the confusion, it's almost impossible to find the patch update online nowadays, even from places I would normally get old patches from, suggesting that particular patch update disc may have been the main way multiplayer was distributed. Because yes, the patch was primarily to add multiplayer support and fix a couple VR headset issues. Now, I did ultimately find a copy of the patch online, but not until it was too late to properly test it out. But again, it doesn't change the gameplay at all, so I don't think I would have really noticed any significant differences.
We now go to the High Lord Panimus as he officially opens this round of competition.
So let's make some sense of this mess. The primary goal of the game is to pilot a special flying vehicle known as a Zephyr through a series of 8 races to make as much money as possible. Before each round begins, you're treated to a cutscene presented as a sort of sports news broadcast. Well, these are actually done pretty solidly, but unfortunately they're identical every time you play through the game, with the exception of which 2 fictional sponsors are mentioned at the start of each broadcast, which are both completely randomized. So you're going to be skipping these before too long. Then you choose which mega corporation out of 6 you wish to be sponsored by for the race, each of whom provides you with your Zephyrs for the race, each of which have 5 primary stats to keep in mind: weapons, engine, shields, computer, and battery. But quite frankly, these stats barely make much of a difference. I mean, they do make a difference, just not a big one. Weapons determines how powerful your attacks are, engine determines how fast you move, shields determines how much damage you can withstand, computer affects the quality of the radar system in some way I was never really able to figure out, and the battery affects how much energy can be stored for both your engines and your guns, each of which gets separate energy buffers. I should also point out that as you complete rounds, you'll occasionally come to choose your sponsor, and some of them will be off limits. I wasn't able to figure out exactly what's happening, but basically, some of the computer players are getting to choose their sponsors ahead of you, and there seems to be multiple factors which play into this, one of the most pertinent being your final score in the last race compared to everyone else, where the lower you placed, the more sponsors you can choose from. But it doesn't work precisely like this, which is why I feel there's more to it than just that. You'll also sometimes get an extra mission to go after a specific competitor during the race and destroy them, earning yourself a corporate bonus if you do. I was never able to succeed at this, so I have no idea what these corporate bonuses entail. But then, the race begins. Yeah, this is about as much a race as Carmageddon is a race. Actually, less. See that timer up there at the top of the screen? Well, these races are not about who finishes first, but rather it's all about score. And you raise your score either by shooting down one of the various targets strewn around, by defeating opponents, or by completing laps around the course. So what you're actually trying to do is make laps as fast as you can while shooting as much as you can in the process, and the more laps you make, the more points you get at the end. Now, your cockpit shows quite a bit of pertinent information. From left to right, we first have the shields and damage display. If any one part of your Zephyr is destroyed, your entire craft goes down and costs you a significant amount of points in the final score tally. But you otherwise have infinite lives. Next is the missile counter. Next is your engine energy gauge. Then comes the speedometer and throttle gauges, showing you how fast you're moving, as well as how fast your craft wants to move based on your throttle setting. Then comes the energy for your guns, your compass, and finally the radar, which is, well, about as useful as it looks. Or to be more clear, totally freaking useless almost. And it can tell you where you are on the course, but because of how rapidly everything plays out, it's really hard to make good use of this thing for anything other than that. Actually, looking at that radar, you're going to be wondering how you're supposed to make laps around something that looks more like an open world than a bona fide course. And it's actually not that tricky. Each map has checkpoints, which are spaced out fairly far apart from each other, typically around the outer edges. Hit each checkpoint once, and you complete a lap. The order you hit them in does not matter. You can literally do the checkpoints backwards, you'll still clear the laps for it. Again, the race, quote-unquote, is for points within a time limit, with no upper limit on how many laps you're expected to make. But more laps equals more points. Each map is also littered with random power-ups. These include special guns, which have special effects when they hit opponents, like flipping their direction, freezing them in place, or sapping their energy. Ammo packs to give you more ammunition for the special guns, which you can collect without the matching gun, but you won't be able to use that ammo until you find the gun it's for. Regular missiles, nuclear missiles, which are way more powerful, but look pretty much the same. Shield restorations, superchargers, which basically reset all your stats to maximum, and I'm pretty sure there's more than that, but it's so easy to glance over so much of what's here just because you have no time to think about any of it. In fact, just to rub salt in the wound as to how fast this game moves despite being capped at literally 11.5 frames per second, there's an option to uncap the frame rate, which you would think, hooray, I can play the game at a full 70 FPS. And yes, if you unregulate the frame rate, it will hit 70, same as a typical VGA 320x200 refresh rate. But the speed of the gameplay is also linked to the frame rate. So good job, you now have to play the game 6 times faster than before. Yeah, just try to play the game like this, I freaking dare you. Now, ironically, this does not affect the round timer, which is always locked at proper seconds. So with the frame rate this high, the AI scores are kind of excessive since they can do so much more in a single round. There's two more things I want to point out, which leads me to believe they rushed this out the door as fast as they could so that they could return to other projects. Firstly, engine energy. You'll notice there's actually 6 different levels of power your engines can be pushed at going forwards, represented by ticks on the throttle gauge. Now at speed 4, your engine energy will be stable and will not change. At lower speeds, your engine energy recharges. However, at higher speeds, your engine energy slowly runs down, and once it gets to a certain point, you'll actually start moving slower and slower until you ultimately come to a complete stop. This is one of the worst mechanics I've ever seen in a racing game. Here's the thing, when you're racing in a racing game, you want the pedal to the metal most of the time, letting go only for taking tight corners or dealing with obstacles, and if there's a limited mechanic such as boosts or nitros, it has to be activated with a special button so that you're not always burning through it. Here in this game, it's just the higher setting on the throttle. So you have to purposefully set yourself to a lower throttle rate so as not to burn out your engine energy, which is hard to do given the rapid pace of everything going on. And on top of that, you slow down if your engine energy gets low. It's incredibly difficult to track all of this while under constant attack, while trying to maneuver around these courses. It's just incredibly unfun to deal with. But the worst offender of all is that the in-game menu is broken. I swear, what you're looking at right now is uncut, and it's just me trying to bring up the in-game menu so that I can alter some settings mid-game, but it's not having it. Now, this could just be an emulation thing, except for the fact that about 1 out of every 100 or so tries, it works fine. So I'm not entirely convinced it's emulation to blame here, but if anyone has any experience running this game on real hardware, let me know how reliable the in-game menu is, and I can post the extra details in the video description. Although I did notice the game is auto-saving my progress, so that's nice. Overall, if you were an average DOS gamer and picked this up expecting fun and exciting racing with flying vehicles and combat mechanics, well, you'd be exceptionally disappointed. Many critics were too, as very few magazines of the time gave this thing anything above a below average review, and I think even those scores are being a bit generous. But there is one last thing I want to mention about the gameplay, which leads me to believe there was a very specific audience for this game, and that average DOS gamers were not it. Remember how I mentioned the 1.1 patch also fixed some VR headset bugs? Well, this game features the ability to rotate your turret contrary to the direction you're moving it, so that you can shoot things more easily while still performing laps properly. This works very badly with the keyboard due to the low frame rate and, well, any lack of any real indication of where you're aiming compared to where you're moving. But this would fit in with VR head tracking perfectly. So I have a funny feeling this game was specifically intended for the early VR crowd, and that the game probably plays at least a little better when played in that manner. I've also read that the multiplayer added in the patch is better than the single player, so I guess what it comes down to is that to get the most enjoyment out of this game, you needed to not only be into combat racing, but also have a VR headset with head tracking and play it multiplayer with other people with the same setup. That would make this game more niche than pretty much every game ever, even the modern VR stuff out there now. And for everyone else who doesn't meet all of those criteria, you're either going to have a mediocre time or a bad time. So, yeah, I don't recommend this thing at all unless you got an old DOS-compatible VR headset with head tracking you feel like dusting off one more time. Thankfully, leaving cycle set to auto is all you have to do if you want to play the game with a keyboard. There is mouse control support, but the mouse controls are horrible, so I don't recommend using them. The joystick controls are also pretty bad unless you have a flight stick with a proper throttle, in which case you need to make sure timed intervals are turned on, as the joystick support doesn't seem to work right without it, and even then, only the throttle is handled with any level of analog detection, and the other axes are all handled digitally. So it's really not any better than playing with a keyboard, short of the added throttle control. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. 2 episodes remain for Season 5, and for episode 249, coming out on Saturday, October 6th, we're going to be taking a look at one of the most highly requested games on my request list at the moment, which is curious given its tank controls. And if you think you know of a game like that, which a lot of people would want to see, then be sure to send your guess in to adg@pixelships.com, and stay tuned because I'm curious to find out more about this game, given that I've never actually played it before.
Time has expired.
Pretty good.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.